What is going on, guys? Welcome to the episode. Today we're going to be chatting about marijuana because I get asked about my thoughts on the relationship between weed and fat loss all the time. So let's dig into the details here. I'm going to break this down into 4 distinct sections. So we're going to look at the impacts of marijuana on nutrition, movement, sleep, and stress management. And at the end, we're going to tie everything together and see whether it may be helping your overall fat loss results or hindering them. I will mention that I'm not going to talk about the potential direct health impacts of consuming marijuana itself, but rather how it may or may not impact your lifestyle and then downstream your health. So for example, I'm not going to be addressing how potentially harmful smoking a joint is via the physical smoke going into your lungs, but I am going to address everything else related to how marijuana might impact your habits and lifestyle as a whole. So first up, we've got nutrition. There are no impacts on fat loss or fat gain itself from marijuana because weed doesn't contain any calories. However, if you crush a whole bunch of edible brownies, it's not actually going to be the marijuana that contributes to your calorie load, but the brownies will for sure. Now, having said that, some folks find that being high impacts their appetite and eating patterns in a big way, hence the munchies. We've all heard about them. Some people seem to be outliers in the sense that weed doesn't impact their food intake all that much, but I'd say that's typically the exception, not the rule. Personally, I'm usually a bottomless pit. If I take a puff of a joint, give me all the food, give it to me now, and forget about satiation signals. I'm just going to eat until I can't physically fit any more food in my stomach, and then I'm walking around with a tortoiseshell-like food baby. So just know thyself, and if you find that being high spikes your appetite, marijuana isn't going to be your friend when it comes to fat loss from a nutrition standpoint. Now, if you do really want to consume marijuana, but you don't want to overeat, I'd recommend jigging up your food environment in a way where you only have access to healthful food that's congruent with your goals. Meaning, don't keep all sorts of treats at arm's reach because you're going to crush them and put a serious dent in your progress. I'd actually recommend modifying your food environment even if you're sober 24/7 because why make it harder than it needs to be, right? This fat loss stuff is hard enough as it is, so set yourself up for success by keeping plenty of healthful food on hand and ditching the hyper-palatable treat foods that make overdoing things essentially a certainty. Movement. So the marijuana and movement relationship is an interesting one because some folks actually really enjoy getting high before doing a physical activity. For example, when I was in high school, I used to smoke weed before every single workout. My friends and I would literally smoke and walk directly into the gym and lift weights. Now, to be fair, I used to do everything high. So maybe take that with a grain of salt because I definitely don't have that same inclination now. But some people do seem to like that feeling of physical activities when they're high. I'd say that the majority of people lean towards melting into the couch, but there does seem to be a non-negligible number of folks that find getting high really puts them in tune with their bodies in a physical sense, and they enjoy movement along with that feeling. So the movement piece, like nutrition, depends on the person. So if you find that marijuana doesn't reduce your overall movement, have at it. But if it does, I'd recommend skipping it or at least skipping it until you've hit your 10,000 step movement quota for the day. On to sleep. Unfortunately, weed is going to impact your sleep architecture in a meaningful way. And that's just a fancy way of saying that your body and brain aren't going to go through the proper sleep cycles in the same way that they would have if you hadn't consumed weed. So that's definitely something to consider. Alcohol is far worse, so if you're choosing between the two in regards to sleep, weed absolutely wins. But having said that, some folks find that marijuana helps them get and stay asleep, and without it, they'd end up getting far less total sleep. And in an instance like this, marijuana might be a net win, at least in the short term. However, the primary question that pops up for me here is, why are you having trouble sleeping to begin with? Meaning, why do you need a substance to fall and stay asleep? So that's going to be the first and foremost question to ponder, because if you can clean up some other aspects of your lifestyle that make it possible to get the sleep that you need without assistance and therefore side effects of a drug, that's the best case scenario, of course. It's worth mentioning that marijuana is also a far better sleep aid than sleep drugs like benzodiazepines and the hypnotics. In my opinion, sleep drugs are one of the most dangerous substances out there, and I would recommend that someone essentially avoid them at all costs whenever possible, because most folks start using sleep drugs and never end up actually coming off of them. And I've heard of a number of people going on sleep drugs and developing Alzheimer's and dementia, and I've mentioned this on previous podcasts before. There seems to be a very tight correlation between poor or short sleep, sleep drugs, and neurocognitive decline, which makes perfect sense because we see the buildup of things like amyloid beta plaques in the brain, reaction time decline, memory impairment, word recall difficulties, and all sorts of undesirable outcomes. But this episode is about weed, so we'll leave that topic for another day. So marijuana does impact sleep in a meaningful way, and that's absolutely something to consider because sleep is so important. However, if you are going to smoke or ingest some weed in some way or another, I'd recommend keeping it as far away from your bedtime as possible. Just like alcohol, the further you can keep it from the time in which you go to sleep, the less it's going to impair your sleep quality. Stress management. This is probably the most complex aspect around why you might not want to consume marijuana, just because everyone copes with stressors in different ways, and everyone's stressors vary as far as what they are and how they impact each individual. Stress is fascinating in the sense that it's so linked with perception because the exact same event can happen to multiple people, and yet they experience that event in a completely different way based on who they are, their past experiences, their beliefs, their mood and sense of well-being when they actually experience the stressor itself, and on and on and on. Personally, I kind of like having the odd puff of a joint once in a while, and it does tend to relax me if I need relaxing. However, if I'm actually unsettled or worried about something, it seems to magnify the stressor because I start thinking about it on loop and completely irrationally when I'm high. So for myself, weed is something that I only consume when all of my ducks are in a row, so to speak, and it's more of a celebratory situation. Also, I have a rule for myself that I never consume weed on back-to-back days, and the same goes for alcohol, just because I find that if I have these substances on back-to-back days, it's extremely hard not to have it on the third day and enter the snowball effect. So I find that this rule is helpful for myself. I rarely actually smoke weed, and I don't drink very often either. However, I still find this little rule really beneficial. You can actually implement this rule around nutrition too, if you'd like, and you can position it in a number of different ways. So for example, maybe you implement a rule that you never eat out 2 days in a row. That could assist you with your goals. Or perhaps you never consume treat foods 2 days in a row, or you never have dessert 2 days in a row. You know, some folks really like rules like this and others don't. I personally do. I like structure and discipline in some areas of my life, and a lot of other areas I don't. So find out what your inclination is, what works for you, and choose your setup based on that. Also, it's important to look at all this stuff in a big picture context. So for example, some people find that they get sort of antisocial when they smoke weed, and if they start smoking on a regular basis, that could then impact their social life in a big way, and their community could quite literally get smaller. We're social animals, and we need a lot of human interaction, and therefore it's worth looking at all the downstream impacts of your decisions because nothing occurs in a vacuum, and there are all sorts of unintended consequences that start to pop up when you look through more of a macro lens versus a micro lens. So there are no impacts on fat loss or fat gain itself from consuming marijuana. However, it can impact your habits and behaviors quite drastically. So what you can do is take a step back and look at how weed impacts your nutrition, movement, sleep, and stress management as a whole, weigh the pros and cons, and then decide whether it fits into your lifestyle or not. Or maybe it's just a super casual thing that you do a few times a year, whatever works for you. The concept of marijuana and fat loss is very similar to the stress and weight gain relationship because stress itself doesn't contain any calories and therefore it cannot cause you to gain weight or lose weight. However, how you respond to stress via your actions and habits can absolutely impact your body composition. You can even apply this same concept of how you respond to something like your phone or social media. The thing itself isn't inherently evil, but how we interact and use it can either provide a net benefit to our lives or a net loss. And the only person that can determine which one that is you. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. And lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.